Since the debut of the epic sci-fi Dune last year, suddenly the demand for a second installment has been louder than ever, and thankfully, fans' pleas have been heard because Dune Part 2 is set for release later this year. And for today's episode, we'll be talking about how Tim Blake Nelson's Dune 2 casting can only mean two things and what to expect in Dune Part 2. So make sure you keep watching if you don't want to miss out. So will Tim Blake Nelson play Count Fenring in Dune Part 2, or will he play someone else? We are entering the year of Dune. Timothée Chalamet and other sources claim that on December 12, 2022, Dune filming for Part 2 was completed. Yet, the new cast members are still being introduced to us. The Hollywood Reporter reported on January 6, 2023 that Tim Blake Nelson would be appearing in Dune Part 2. His character, however, has not yet been revealed. Boris Kitt, a journalist, put it this way: the specifics of Nelson's role are being kept in the dark. Who then is Nelson starring as? The majority of clues point to a single major character from the first Frank Herbert novel. On the other hand, a more significant turn of events might result in a third Dune movie. First, let's talk about Count Fenring in Dune Part 2. The good money for the character played by Tim Blake Nelson in Dune Part 2 is unquestionably Count Hajmir Fenring, the husband of Lady Margot Fenring, played by Léa Seydoux, and childhood friend of Christopher Walken's Emperor Shaddam IV. Count Fenring is the only person who hasn't been cast in any of the remaining largish roles from the first book. Additionally, considering that Seydoux and Walken will each make their Dune debuts as Lady Margot and Shaddam IV, it would be odd if the film also did not feature Count Fenring. But even though Lady Margot and Count Fenring are mentioned early on, they do not actually appear in a present until the book's final third. Fenning and Margot are watching a gladiatorial fight featuring Fade Rotha on Giedi Prime in the royal court of Baron Harkonnen on page 521 of the Kindle version. Relevantly, even though the Harkonnens have conspired with the Emperor to betray House Atreides, the Fenrings are loyal to the Emperor and not necessarily on their side. The book's main plot point is when Count Fenring tells the Baron straight up that the Emperor is mad about how the Harkonnens got back Arrakis. This is extremely significant because of the subtle shift in the story's overall direction caused by Fenring's warnings to the Baron. Not only do Paul and the Freemen need to defeat the Harkonnens, but they also need to remove the Emperor from his position. That change makes no sense without Lady Margot and Count Fenring. We also may experience flashbacks in Dune if Tim Blake Nelson plays Count Fenring second part. He and Lady Margot lived in Arrakis before the story began, and he was the Emperor's childhood friend. He also helped the Emperor rise to power. Since we already talked about Count Fenring in Part 2, we might as well address Scytale in the upcoming installment as well. There is a remote possibility that Tim Blake Nelson will play Scytale, a character from Dune Messiah, if he does not portray Count Fenring. Scytale is a part of the plot against Paul and his family in Messiah, which includes a resurrected Gola, or clone of Duncan, Idaho. Scytale is a member of the Bene Tleilax, masters of bringing people back to life, and a face dancer. Dune's introduction of Scytale in Part 2 may suggest that the planned trilogy, 2 movies about the first book and 1 about Messiah, might come to pass. It seems possible that this could be teased in Part 2 because the return of Duncan, Idaho in the form of a Gola hate is so important to Messiah and also to the rest of the original book series. Many times, Denis Villeneuve has stated that he wants to make a trilogy of films. Duncan, Idaho, played by Jason Momoa, will return in that case. Additionally, Scytale and the Bene Tleilax are required for that to take place. Is Tim Blake Nelson's role going to be made public before Dune? When does the sequel come out? Maybe, however, if it isn't, Scytale might be a better bet than the more obvious Count Fenring. And in other related news, here are some other things we could look forward to in Dune Part 2. Of course, the movie will have a 2-year time jump. It makes sense that the story would jump ahead a few years because it gives Paul, played by Timothée Chalamet, and Jessica, played by Rebecca Ferguson, enough time to adjust to their new lives among the Freemen. As Paul matures into his role as Freeman leader, it also enables him to better manage his precognitive abilities. It makes sense that the filmmakers will decide to keep the book's timeline because Part 2 will be released in 2 years. Also in Dune Part 2, we'll also get to see the new mental of the Baron. You'll probably still haven't figured out what happened to Stephen McKinley Henderson's Thufir Hawat, who plays Leto's computer man. He made it through the Harkonnen invasion of Arrakis, which will make you happy. However, in the book, his previous mentat, Peter de Vries, was killed by Duke Leto's poison gas, so he was forced to serve Stellan Skarsgård's Baron as his new mentat. Fortunately, he worked inside the Harkonnens to undermine them. Another thing to look forward to in the sequel is a return of Gurney Halleck. You might also be curious about the fate of Gurney Halleck, played by Josh Brolin. He also survived the Arrakis invasion, so don't worry. He stormed into battle against the Harkonnens when we last saw him, but the movie left his fate a mystery. During the 2-year time jump in the book, he takes the Han Solo path and becomes a smuggler before reuniting with Paul and Jessica. Next, we'll also get to see Paul adapting a new name this time around. Throughout the entirety of Part 1, a small desert mouse on Arrakis was frequently depicted, but this is not a minor detail. As he fully integrates into Freeman society, Paul will eventually change his name. Paul decides to name himself after the desert mouse, Muad'Dib, when keeping his first name. Although the mouse's sage and tenacious nature on the planet Arrakis makes it an appropriate moniker for the Freeman Messiah, it may appear to be an odd choice for Paul. In the next movie, we'll also be introduced to one of the Baron's other nephew. Dave Bautista has already been shown to the audience as Glossu Beast Rabban, the Baron's terrifying nephew. However, the Baron has a second nephew waiting behind closed doors. Harkonnen Feyd-Rautha, the Baron, intends to have his younger nephew succeed Rabban as Arrakis' ruler, hoping to win over the populace and replace Rabban's rigid leadership style. Even in a battle that will decide the fate of the universe, Feyd will be Paul's last opponent. And speaking of Rabban, Dune Part 2 will also depict this character's death. Regarding Rabban, some of you might have expected more from the villainous character played by Dave Bautista. However, you should be aware that Rabban dies brutally and appropriately in the book. Rabban is decapitated by the Freemen and the Arrakeen people that he oppressed for so long, after Paul and the Freemen reclaim Arrakis from the Harkonnens, which is pretty brutal. There's more to look forward to in the next film, especially about Paul, like how he rides a sandstorm and the developing romance he has with Chani. Paul will eventually learn to ride a sandworm, like one of them, on his way to leading the Freemen. After Part 1, we only got a brief glimpse of a Freeman riding one of these enormous beasts, but this is definitely a precursor to Paul riding one, much like Daenerys Targaryen flies on one of her dragons. In addition, we had visions of Paul and Zendaya's Chani becoming a romantic couple in the first film, and the second movie should see that happen. In the book, Chani gives birth to Paul's son, Leto II, who unfortunately dies when the Baron attacks a Freeman outpost. Next, the series will also include the birth of Paul's sister. Additionally, Paul anticipated his mother Jessica becoming pregnant with a second child, who would later play a significant role in the narrative. Aaliyah, Paul's sister, is given the powers of her mother in the book after she drinks the water of life. Aaliyah is a remarkable character in the Dune universe because at the age of 2, she can think and talk like an adult. And finally, we'll also get to see the fall of the Baron. Even though Baron Harkonnen escaped death in Part 1, the sequel guarantees that he will meet it. In the book, the Baron was killed by Paul's sister, his own granddaughter, Aaliyah, after all the terrible things he did to Paul and his family. However, Feyd-Rautha, his nephew, will be able to take over as king if he dies, making him the story's final antagonist. Now, there are a lot of things to look forward to in Part 2 about Paul, especially now that his prescience is growing. Paul can see into the future because he is a Kwisatz Haderach. In the first part, we saw a lot of these visions. After being exposed to the spice on Arrakis, his visions only get stronger, but he wants to make them stronger still. Paul drinks the water of life to increase his powers after failing to anticipate an attempt on his mother's life. However, because the substance is harmful to males, he goes into a coma for several weeks before regaining consciousness and realizing his full potential. Aside from all this, the Emperor will finally join the fight in Part 2. Even though Emperor Shaddam IV gave the Baron his army of Sardaukar to invade Arrakis, he's still tried to hide his involvement. However, in the book, he and the Baron sent fleets to Arrakis to try to put an end to the Freeman rebellion. The Freemen, the Harkonnens, and the Emperor's forces will undoubtedly engage in a titanic conflict that is reminiscent of the Lord of the Rings. And speaking of Emperor, we'll also get to see Paul as the new Emperor in Part 2. After defeating the Harkonnens and going up against Emperor Shaddam IV in Herbert's novel, Paul convinces him to give up his throne in exchange for the hand in marriage of his daughter, Princess Irulan. In the first part, Paul says that this can put an end to Shaddam's rule over the universe and keep the great houses from fighting. And that's pretty much everything we know about Dune Part 2. Are you excited to see the sequel? Tell us what you're most excited about in the comment section below. Thanks for watching today's video, and before you go, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel with the notification bell for more videos like these. See you next episode.